Welcome to his author's voice. I am the author, Jack Sanger. The story I'm going to read now in one sitting gestated for quite a long time because when I was an adolescent, I moved from Norse gods and heroes, Greek legends, Roman gods, into the beginnings of science fiction. But I also read adventure stories, and one of the key ones in my development was She by Rider Haggard, because Rider Haggard actually lived on an estate next to one where I worked as a young man. She, in Haggard's terms, was an eternal female. She couldn't die, and there were problems with that. And the adventurer in the story finds her and seeks the possibility of everlasting life. Well, anyway, many decades later, I wrote a science fiction story on a similar theme, but very different, and it's called She, and I'm going to read it now. She. She was built from the genes up to handle the monstrous nature of space and time. As invulnerable as an energy fragment of a supernova, she mixed hibernation with flowering. A solitary traveller programmed to uncover the secrets of the universe. She didn't feel loneliness. She did not feel anxiety. And she never questioned the reason for her lone existence. Connected to her ship through an evolving quantum field of almost infinite impulses, she, in effect, had moulded the ship to her needs, so that she and it were one. Over time, its movement and direction became a consequence of imperatives decided by her and her alone. Her implanted codes, once far below conscious thought, had been unearthed and jettisoned. She was now her own mistress. The spewing signals they sent out constantly mapped space, detailed star systems, measured the mercurial dance between dark energy and dark matter. Like the parachutes of the ancient Terran dandelion, spinning in the wind and landing wherever, they scattered photons to be disentangled across multiple points, flicked through wormholes and across brain bridges to arrive at their destinations at the same moment as their sending, or even before. The primary point of reception of the flashing signature of her ship's presence was the world wherein lived the authors of her original construction. In the orbit of a planet denser and more massive than its own, they had created a floating workshop, a forge for a new kind of humanity, whose genetics combined a power and resolve as far removed again as that which separated the first mammalian venture upon solid earth from its aquatic prehistory. By introducing threads of DNA from flora and fauna of their home world, scientists had bred new capabilities into generations like her and sent them foraging across the galaxy. She could see beyond the normal visible spectrum into the ultraviolet and the infrared, and in the same way her other senses were developed to the extremes, manifested by the most specialized species on that home world. Her body required a fraction of the oxygen of terra, grounded humankind. And her muscular strength and propulsive power were immense. Even her skin and underlying cellular structures were evolved to protect her, shielding her from any debilitating excesses of radiation that might leak through the ship's shield. She was the supreme rendition of that quest for the perfect expeditionary warrior, a symphony of traits and qualities which optimized the human capacity to survive and regenerate almost eternally in that icy emptiness where prolonged exposure had once reduced her ancestors to accelerated senility or left them incapably insane. And now she was moving at sublight speeds to her genetic home, that world on which had flourished all the building blocks from which she had originally been constructed. The desire to go to her home planet was not a conscious one at first, it was imprinted in her genes. As her body regenerated over time, it lay undetected at the core of whom she was. When her makers were manipulating the basic structures of the egg which gave rise to her, they added an imperative, to return, found in the eel's mating imperative. It was the fail-safe mechanism they had introduced even in the prototypes, so that they and their descendants could check on the condition and viability of their human probes. Earth had debated for decades about the moral and ethical issues surrounding parameters for genetic engineering. Mutations to combat disease were immediately accepted, but the work to produce superhuman qualities was eventually limited to off-world creatures who might pave the way to the stars and planets of the galaxy beyond. Even as more and more advanced versions left the orbiting biological workshop to roam at will across the heavens, a receiving centre was evolving on the bed of the Sargasso Sea, as it was originally called on Earth. Here scientists worked continually on processes for monitoring the soul voyagers and forecasting within days their likely docking with Earth and descent to the planet's surface. Generally, it was agreed that it would be at this point that these pilots of outer space would be decommissioned. Tests had shown that the constant replenishing of human cells over time and their interaction with the essential loneliness of solo voyaging would inevitably lead to unpredictable mutations, and some of these might be a risk to a more naturally evolving civilization. Such was the thinking. And it worked. Knowledge of the universe married theoretical physics with actuality. Earth-like planets were discovered. The human species began hopping to systems around the near stars. Some of the genetics learned from the pilot probes were judiciously introduced to enable a faster exodus. Eventually, the days of the space warrior were over. All were taken out of service. Then, as so often happens in the ways of humankind, a glitch was discovered. It was long after the reception centre at the bottom of the sea had become a solitary training outpost for Terran marine biology, and a largely inconsequential Earth had been reduced to a tourist attraction for those who wished to visit the birthplace of their interstellar empire. A warrior's ship's signature suddenly appeared on the charts of the edge of the Earth's solar system. Records of star travellers had long since been lost to archives, but the broadcasts emitted from it showed the occupant to be a female, profiled as She 1000, and had probably been foraging the firmament for centuries. The prevailing assumption was that this woman was among the last upgrades, furnished with genes too dubiously useful to ever be required by the migrating population, and worse, that she had an inbuilt capacity to evolve herself and her vessel over time to overcome the hazard she encountered. Empire ministers met with scientists to determine a strategy to deal with She 1000. If the general population came to hear of her presence, there would be a clamour to venerate her and laud her achievements. The arts were permeated with myths and legends concerning the early solo voyagers and their exploits. Meanwhile, her potential threat to civilization could be critical. The debate resulted in a decision to destroy her quietly, out there where no one would ever know she had emerged from the lost annals of ancient history. Since her day, offensive weaponry had evolved beyond all recognition. Her very cells were oscillating with excitement. It was a new and delightful sensation, one she had to wrestle with to understand. The emotion-free, multidimensional logic that had dominated her entire existence had suddenly become porous and wavering. She began to dream, and what she dreamed about broke into her waking hours as daydreams. Visions of Earth through time, both before and after the emergence of humankind, the millions of species that had come and gone. The vital integration of the living, the life force that dominated everything through shared gene codes on Earth. The bee and bird DNA in her sight, the eel DNA in her homing instinct, the cockroach DNA in her epidermis, the bacterial DNA that conferred only a little need for oxygen. These and all the other building blocks were chiming inside her, throwing up memories that were all too real in her mind. It would not be long before she was home. Home. A word She 1000 had never really embraced until now. She and the ship hurtled on, all their experiences in time and space combining to make perfect manoeuvres across the void, an instinctual pathway that had already threaded through asteroid belts and orbiting moons, the gigantic gravitational forces of stars and planets, black holes and pulsar streams. Then the gradual deceleration as they swung out along the further reaches of the crab-like arm of stars. Slowly and imperceptibly the ship covered itself in its weapons shield, a technology gained through contact with a peaceful, benign intelligence at the furthest limit of their journeying. It was now receiving more and more evidence that the systems they were travelling through had a constant history of hostility, all of it emanating from the human species, her species. She 1000 noted it surprised. They had very rarely had to organize their defenses to this degree. They considered whether they should take the final step in self-protection. Reluctantly, they departicularized themselves, spreading their substance in a diaphanous dispersal across quantum dimensions. It further reduced their speed, but at once they became lost to all forms of detection. When the ministers were informed that She 1000 had ceased to exist, that some accident had befallen her and her ship, they put a message out across the empire about what had nearly been. A heroine had been lost on the last stage of her return home. There was much sadness everywhere. Wakes were held. The opportunity to see one of the true heroines of their advancement from ape to star people had been denied humankind. There were dramatic enactments of heroic sagas, Poetry was recited, and songs were sung of the great formative adventures in space history. A young male was engaged in data analysis in the dome under the Sargasso Sea. He had only 1 month left before he could leave Earth and return to Triton. He longed for his childhood views across the nitrogen wastelands. Solitude did not depress him unduly, but enough time had been spent here learning the basics of his trade. He turned on the wide field 3D holographic cameras to capture the returning eel shoals and sat back, sucking a vitamin drink. At once his brow furrowed. The shoal of eels had suddenly displayed a bizarre flight pattern, as though following the lines of spokes outwards from an unseen hub. Though he could not see it, the cloud of fleeing creatures demarcated a distinctly perfect oval. It was worth reporting to his professor. He switched on communications, but there was nothing. A dull silence. Then, as though the beam out had been interrupted, there was a different quality of audio background, alive but unique. "Do not be afraid, I am coming inside," said a voice. The accent was unlike any he knew. He heard the airlock doors opening and closing, despite the internal overrides, and turned to meet whoever it was. There, undoubtedly benign and recognizable as human, was a female, much taller than him, naked and heavily muscled, her skin given to overlapping dark scaling, her hair black and tightly curled, tied in a thick topknot, her eyes piercing with a violet luster, her fingers and toes long and equally prehensile. Her form radiated strength and purpose. In her lower belly, between her massive thighs, was a pulsating, hair-enshrouded orifice, growing larger by the moment. She stepped towards him. The ship and She-1000 accelerated back along the crab arm towards the massive black hole at the centre of the galaxy. They'd now returned to being a solid entity again and lifted the weapon shields. She experienced a curious mixture of sensations. She was nourished by the recent daydreams, the curious comfort of ancestral lineage, and that integrated pulsing force that communicated across all that lived on the Terran world. But stronger, dominating every cell of her being, was the independent, expanding life in her belly. She-1000 and her ship set course for that part of the galaxy where they had not yet ventured. She wondered how different it would seem with company. And that, as they say, is that. My version of She. I hope you enjoyed it. There are other short stories, novels, plays, even non-fiction, Zen-inspired aphorisms, all on my site. You can go there by linking to www.jacksanga.com. In the menu bar at the top, you'll see all the different genres, and you can go where you like. I hope you do. Next time I'll be going back to extracts, I think, from a novel. But for the moment, this is just a bonus story. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now. Bye-bye.